Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Could I call the committee to order and welcome DCI Settle. Thank you very much for coming in, DCI Settle, at such very short notice. We're most grateful. Can I refer everyone present to the Register of Members' Interests, where the interests of members of this committee are noted? Are there any additional declarations relevant to this witness?
In addition to my declaration that I am a practicing barrister, prior to my election I conducted a number of cases on behalf of the Metropolitan Police as an independent barrister.
Thank you. We are concerned today, DCI Settle, with the issues of process only. We are not interested in ongoing police investigations into any other issues apart from the process relating to the allegations made by the witness Jane about the late Lord Brittan. So that is where we will confine our questions, and I would be grateful if you could do the same. You obviously have a lot of experience in these matters, but that is what we want to talk about to you today. Can you just describe the role that you had in relation to this?
I was Senior Investigating Officer for Operation Fairbank and associated operations from November 2012 when it started. That meant that I was the Detective Chief Inspector that was basically responsible in running the cases.
And were you also involved in the Operation Vincenze? Which
I was, sir. I commenced the Operation Vincenze on the 20th of December 2012.
And did that relate specifically to the allegation of the witness Jane concerning Lord Brittan, the late Lord Brittan?
It related solely to that allegation, and it was set up in isolation because it was an allegation made by an adult female of rape, and I was aware of the sensitivities right from the outset, so it was set up as a standalone operation and conducted in isolation from anything else that was happening.
Now, much of what you had to deal with that you thought would be confidential is now already in the public domain.
That's right, yes.
Which is obviously a matter of great regret, because it's clearly caused a great deal of distress to the family of the late Lord Brittan and presumably to him at the time. You have very kindly provided the committee with a paper setting out all the circumstances, some of which we will put into the public domain, not all of it, because not all of it's relevant. But in particular, I want to take you to the decision time. You made a decision on the 4th of September about the allegation and about the evidence that you had. What was the decision that you took about the allegation made by the witness Jane?
On the 4th of September 2013, and following the advice I'd received from the Crown Prosecution Service, and in conjunction with further advice from the Crown Prosecution Service regarding the police applying what's known as the code test, I decided that the investigation should not proceed any further. My reason for that was that I concluded that any action against Lord Brittan would be grossly disproportionate and would not have a legal basis, as in order to interview him we would have to have had reasonable grounds to suspect that an evidence had been committed. The investigation had shown that whilst an allegation had been made, the offence had not been made out in law, and as such those reasonable grounds had ceased.
So you found that there was no reasonable grounds at all, and you went to the CPS. Did you have any difficulty, because this will become an issue in relation to other witnesses, did you have any difficulty in getting advice from the CPS?
Absolutely not. I reviewed all the evidence that we had against Lord Brittan on the 7th of June, and it's a long time since I was at detective school, and I looked at the evidence and I thought I'm not quite sure about this. So I sought what's known as early investigative advice from the Crown Prosecution Service. The report that I sent up was completely anonymised, so there was no mention of Lord Brittan whatsoever in there, so that we'd get a completely objective and biased view. The report came back, and that concurred with my thoughts that the offence of rape had not been made out, and that was specifically on the account that the victim, Jane, had given us. That's before we spoke to anybody else, which we had done, but on the victim's account alone, it was unreasonable to suspect that anybody would have known that consent was an issue.
So there was no reason, in your view, to either interview him or to cause any further investigations to take place?
Absolutely not. I made an entry basically saying that I did not feel the arrest of Lord Brittan was a proportionate response. The matter was over 40 years old. The offence was not clear-cut. The additional witnesses that we had traced, despite it being 40 years old, did not support Lord Brittan's presence. Jane had only identified him from a certificate she had allegedly seen, and I was not convinced the necessary points for the offence had been proved. In addition, something I was also conscious of, there was no right of anonymity for persons arrested, and there had been significant media intrusion around an arrestees. To put that into perspective, it was at the same time that Cttee was running.
You met the complainant and you explained this to the complainant, did you?
I met with the complainant on the 17th of February and I explained it in full, and at that meeting she asked for me to provide a written response as to why I'd ceased the operation.
You didn't inform the late Lord Brittan or his solicitors, presumably because this was not in the public domain at that stage anyway?
It was not in the public domain, and to use a very well-worn quote, I didn't want to give it the oxygen of publicity. At that stage, there was no reason for me to inform Lord Brittan. I regret that I didn't, purely because had I informed him that there was formally no further action and an allegation had been made, then maybe it would have been slightly difficult to revisit it.
Shortly after you made your decision, you met with Tom Watson,
That's
according
correct.
to your statement.
Mr. Watson had been...
on the 10th of February.
I met with Jane. I'd met with Mr. Watson periodically to keep him abreast of details with the investigation, because Mr. Watson had been an intermediary for an awful lot of the complainants and was aware of their personal details with the investigation, because Mr. Watson had been an intermediary for an awful lot of the complainants and was aware of their personal cases, and the purpose of me meeting with him and keeping him abreast was trying to deconflict and reassure him what we were doing and why we were doing it, so he retained confidence in the investigation.
And what was his view about your decision?
To be perfectly honest, at the time, he didn't express any concerns whatsoever, and I explained in full the reason for my decision and why. And it was a highly unusual decision, in that I'm aware that there's guidelines that say we always interview the suspect, but the problem is those grounds to interview the suspect had ceased, because it was a highly unusual set of circumstances where, on the victim's account alone, the actual offence wasn't made out. I explained that to him. I also explained to him regarding two other matters that he was aware of, where people had made allegations against the late Lord Brittan. I explained to him where we were with those.
Right. Did you therefore were you surprised then when this was reopened as a result of Mr. Watson's letter?
If I'm being frank, I am extremely disappointed, because I would have thought before doing that I had the type of relationship with him where he could have phoned me to seek clarity, and had I not assured him of that clarity, then he was perfectly within his rights to write that letter. But I was rather shocked.
Did you see it as a criticism of you? Criticism of the investigation?
I saw it as a betrayal, to be perfectly honest, because I thought that I'd been frank and honest with him and transparent from the outset. We'd had him visit our office, we'd had him meet our team, so that he could gain confidence in what we were doing and understand that we would take the investigation where the evidence led us. We weren't there with an agenda, we were there to do a job. It was as simple as that. And I saw it as a very low blow, to be perfectly honest.
Now, in the newspapers, it is quoted as, maybe not you, but those close to you, suggesting that you felt that what he had done undermined your investigation. Is that the case?
Yes, I felt that it undermined our investigation because, put bluntly, at that time we had Operation Cttee running with a lot of officers and a lot of resources, and my investigative team consisted of 6 people and me. And we had a full diary for the forthcoming 2 weeks, and any distractions that we had took us away from the job that we were there to do.
So what happened after that? The matter was reopened?
The matter was reviewed by another senior officer who didn't look at all the documents, and in particular didn't look at my decision log. My decision log is a contemporaneous note of decisions made at the time and the rationale why I've made those decisions. And it's an intrinsic part, and it's a fundamental part of all major investigations. That was not examined. A review was done on limited documentation, and that, in my opinion, wrongly concluded that the obvious line of inquiry was to interview Lord Brittan.
And why do you think that was done? What drove the Metropolitan Police into continuing with this after you had reviewed all the evidence and had CPS advice? Why do you think this was done?
On the dates, I think speak for themselves. On the 17th of May, it was revealed that Mr Watson had written a letter. On the 18th of May, there was a newspaper article. On the 19th of May, a Herod review was carried out.
And do you think that was because of his letter?
I think it was a direct result of that. I'm aware that the review may well have been ordered 2 weeks before. I wasn't aware of that at the time. What I do know is the 17th of May was a Saturday, the 18th of May a Sunday, and the 19th of Monday, i.e. the first day back in the office after the weekend newspapers.
It's fairly unusual, is it not, for an officer conducting an operational matter to be keeping a Member of Parliament informed of the developments that you were telling Mr Watson about.
And we were in a position where we were trying to sift through those. And in fairness, I had a measure of sympathy for Mr Watson because, and we were in a position where we were trying to sift through those. And in fairness, I had a measure of sympathy for Mr Watson because after he'd asked his question, he was deluged with people coming forward and making allegations to him.
After you'd asked which question?
After
he spoke in the House?
After he spoke in the House, he was deluged with people coming forward and making allegations, and wasn't in the best position to well, how do you prepare for that when it's...
But do you regret giving so much...
Well, how do you prepare for that when it's...
But do you regret giving so much information to him?
I don't, because it kept him abreast of the investigation and prevented speculation, because there's been an awful lot of media intrusion into this right from the outset, and an awful lot of speculation and I would say inaccurate reporting regarding this from the beginning. I don't regret keeping him informed because, you know, I'm a firm believer that once you've got a stakeholder in a investigation, it's key to do more harm to ostracise him than it would have done good.
And it was not just one case. He was involved in quite a lot of cases, wasn't he?
There were many cases, and in fairness, we've had, I think, 3 successful prosecutions today as a result of the information that Mr Watson passed to us.
But you must feel quite vindicated at the end because senior officers have now taken over this. They have gone to the CPS. The CPS have said they really don't want to be involved in this because the evidential tests have not been met. And finally, we have a letter from Mr Rodhouse, who we'll be hearing from later, apologising to Lady Brittan about this matter. That must be a complete vindication of the position that you had taken in February 2014.
It may well be, but I take no pleasure from it. Quite frankly, it distracted us from doing our job.
But it took a year and a half later for the family to be informed.
Yes.
Do you think it would have been the right thing to do to have told Lord Brittan while he was still alive?
It's my opinion that had we been in a position where his name came out into open domain, then he should have been told as soon as practicable, as soon as possible.
Thank you. David Burrows.
Your decision that you say didn't go any further in terms of the review, is that the usual practice?
If I was conducting the review, no. I have in my decision log. I have an entry where I've reviewed the evidence to date on I think it's the 7th of July. I've listed all the documentation and all the evidence I looked at when I was reviewing it, so that people are aware of what I've looked at. The review that was conducted looked at about 3 documents.
So where did your decision log go?
It was kept in the office at Empress State Building, West London.
Do you have your decision log on you there?
I don't. I've got a copy of it which I took.
So referring to the copy of your decision log, how do you describe in your log the option of either arresting or interviewing Mr Brittan or both?
Just bear with me a second. I'm rather unprofessional. Shuffle through. At this stage, I do not feel that the arrest or interview of Lord Brittan is a proportionate response. The matter is over 40 years old. The offence is not clear-cut. The additional witnesses do not support Lord Brittan's presence at the time. The victim is sure of the identification from a certificate in his flat, but I am still not convinced that the offence is made out. There is no right of anonymity for persons arrested for sexual offences. Furthermore, there is considerable media intrusion regarding arrestees. At the moment, Lord Brittan is of interest in other aspects of a parallel investigation, and to arrest or interview him now would, I feel, jeopardise any potential inquiries, as this would be nothing more than a baseless witch hunt. I think the interview was without grounds, and I think that the interview consequently was not within the confines of PACE and unlawful.
And what you're referring to, as I understand, is Code C 10A of PACE.
I'll take your word for that.
Which, as a criminal defence solicitor, I can say to you, says that in order to interview Lord Brittan under caution, were there reasonable objective grounds for the suspicion of rape or other allegations based on known facts or information? Now, at the time of your investigation, were there those reasonable objective grounds for that suspicion?
There weren't. They'd ceased. From the outset, when we had the allegation, we're duty bound to investigate it, which we had. The difficulty being is, as we investigated it, those grounds ceased.
And over the passage of time, are you aware of any further piece of evidence that provided reasonable objective grounds based on known facts or information?
Nothing.
So what you're saying to us, when it was grossly disproportionate, it would not have a legal basis, effectively what you're saying to us is that the subsequent interview under caution of Lord Brittan, in your opinion, was unlawful?
That's correct, so yes.
In terms of, we had this letter from Mr. Watson dated 28th of April that says these words. It further troubles me that the senior police officer, no doubt referring to you, who dropped the case, revealed to the victim he apparently took a series of worthless stereotypes and other irrelevant points into consideration. He did this after apparently consulting with an unnamed CPS official. Most of these stereotypes have been blown out of the water in recent months, or so I thought. What are your comments on that?
The meeting that I had with Jane was heated, and I was on the receiving end of what can best be described as a heated exchange. I'm paid to do that. I'm paid to sit and listen and not to respond. Regarding me using stereotypes, and furthermore regarding, I think there's somewhere in there it alleges that I slammed up my papers on the table and stuff like. Anybody that knows me knows that's simply not me. It's not true. I was put in a position where she was understandably upset about my decision, and so was her husband, and they challenged me on it.
And the first paragraph of Mr. Watson's letter is that there was practice which was contrary to ACPO and CPS guidance on the investigation and prosecution of rape cases. Is that true?
It's not, because whilst it is always advisable to interview the suspect, we followed the guidance in that what we did was, we, conscious of who Lord Brittan was, conscious of the impact it would have, and conscious of the media intrusion we would get, I sought to obtain the strongest possible case that we could have against him. The difficulty being, in trying to obtain that strongest possible case, it actually undermined the whole prosecution, and the grounds for us to interview him ceased to exist.
Why was there a delay between September the 13th and September 2013, and February 2014 in informing Mr. Watson or the alleged victim?
Regarding Mr. Watson, that was purely because that was the next time I met with him. I hadn't met with him previously. Regarding Jane, I'd said to my officer, who was her point of contact, that she was going to see her and inform her in person. And I said if she wanted to see me, I would quite happily. The lady lives north in the country, quite a considerable distance away. I said I'd be more than happy to go and see her in person and explain my decision. She wanted that to happen initially. That was arranged. Then she changed her mind and decided she was coming to London. And the earliest she could come to London was the 17th of February.
Prior to the interview of Lord Brittan, were the solicitors in disclosure informed about the decision to take no further action?
I don't know, so it wasn't conducted by me. I was told to have nothing more with the investigation.
And in terms of the impact following the letter of 28th of April to DPP, you no doubt talked to officers around this whole issue. how would you describe the level of impact on the Met Police from the letter from Watson?
It's confused matters considerably because, as I said, we had limited resources and we were there to do a job, and this has distracted us, and it's shook confidence within the team because it has kind of undermined us.
But what was the immediate reaction that you were aware of from that letter hitting the CPS Correspondence Unit inbox on the 1st of May 2014?
I would suggest one of panic amongst some people and one of shock amongst others.
And finally, are you aware of, have you been involved in other cases where members of Parliament have acted as intermediaries?
No.
Thank you, Mr. Burrows. David Winnick.
I'm going to ask you a few questions, Mr. Settle, like other colleagues, and nothing I say should be seen as detrimental regarding the late Lord Brittan. The meeting that you had on the 17th of February 2014 with Tom Watson, as you said, it was a perfectly calm meeting. You gave your views, or the result of the investigation, I should say, so far, and Mr. Watson discussed the matter with you. So you had
Absolutely.
No quarrel about that meeting?
None whatsoever, sir. The meeting was actually on the 10th of February. He was given an update on how the investigation writ large, which had many different strands and aspects to it, was proceeding and where we were, and at no point were any concerns raised whatsoever.
Now, would you say that it's a duty of a citizen, not necessarily by any means a member of Parliament, who has received information that an offence took place, however many years ago, to bring that to the attention as quickly as possible of the police?
Yes, sir. I would like to think that people would do, because that's ultimately what we're here for.
So there's no feeling that Mr. Watson was wrong to bring the information to the police?
No, far from it. He was used as a conduit by many people who, I have to be frank, for whatever reason, had a distrust in the police and wouldn't normally have approached us.
Now, you said, Mr. Settle, and I was impressed by your evidence, you said that Mr. Watson had provided evidence, I'm pretty certain I got it correctly, provided evidence to the police which resulted in 3 successful prosecutions.
That's correct.
So here is a person, politician or otherwise, who has sought to ensure that those who were the subject of various forms of sexual abuse are brought to justice.
Correct.
I mean, to put it frankly, we're not talking about, I hesitate to use terms which could be misinterpreted, but we're not talking about someone who lives in a fantasy world, who hasn't got the slightest idea what is happening, and out of nowhere goes to the police and wastes his police time. Am I right?
Sorry, in respect...
Sorry, I have got it wrong in a long way, but we're not dealing with a fantasist, are we?
In Mr. Watson or...
Mr. Watson, yes.
No, we're not. No, sir.
In no way?
No, sir.
And you accept that he carried out a public duty?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Now, would I not be right to say that all this occurred where there was a climate, in my view, a justified climate, arising from the Savile case, the Smith, the late Smith, who were never brought to justice, and there was a strong feeling, am I right, Mr. Settle, in Parliament and no doubt in the police as well?
There was a very strong feeling. There was a feeling that we'd let people down historically, and that we were there to bring perpetrators to justice at the earliest opportunity.
And it could be, could it not, that Mr. Watson felt that there had been an injustice, that Jane was telling the truth, or at least the police should probe more deeply into the allegations, and that his motive was above board.
It could be, however, the meeting I had with him on the 10th of February, I explained it very simply and thoroughly why we'd made that decision, and as I've said, I would have expected, had he took the view that he subsequently did, I would have expected him to contact me and just clarify the issue before he made representations. We've kind of gone from a 1 on the scale to a 10 on the scale with no justification.
Yes. Now, Mr. Settle, I can understand that you had this meeting, he seemed satisfied, and then later on he wasn't. But I mean, that is really your dispute, isn't it, to a large extent? Then instead of Mr. Watson coming back to you, he acted otherwise.
Yes. But
yes, thank you very much indeed. It's been very
Sorry,
useful.
you wanted to finish your sentence?
No, I'm fine, thank you, sir.
Thank you. Nusrat Ghani.
Thank you. You mentioned in your written statement and also earlier on that you met with Mr. Tom Watson the 10th of February 2014. You met Mr. Tom Watson at the hotel next to the Unite head office. I updated him on all aspects of the investigation to date, as he had acted as an intermediary for a significant number of complainants. So was it unusual for you to have this sort of relationship with other parliamentarians in these cases?
As I said, it was unusual, but it was unusual circumstances.
And did it help you proceed with your work, or was it hindering you doing your work?
To be brutally frank, we had several people come forward that wouldn't normally have come forward, and recently a guy by the name of Richard Alston has just been found guilty and sentenced, and that was a direct result of Mr. Watson's intervention and facilitating the victim through to us.
Do you think it's acceptable for parliamentarians to have this sort of relationship with police officers like yourself?
I think that if there's a case where it's bringing people to justice, then yes, it is.
You mentioned that you also felt undermined in your position. How did you get? You felt undermined by the letter.
I think that was in the media. I've read
Yeah. You mentioned it as well on today. You mentioned it today.
Yeah.
Do you think how did you allow yourself to be undermined by Mr. Watson? How did you get yourself into that position?
By doing my job.
So you felt that you were unable to do your job?
Yes.
Because
and
of Mr.
when I
Watson's
made
intervention?
representations, as a direct result of the correspondence, when I made representations regarding my position on the matter,
Yeah.
I was told to have nothing more to do with them.
Okay. Thank you.
Who told you not to have anything more to do with it?
My line manager, Detective Superintendent Gray.
And how far up the Metropolitan Police chain do you think this went? That people knew that this was going to be opened up again after you reached a conclusion?
I'm pretty sure that it was at commander level.
The commander level?
Yes, that was at that time. That's who was chairing the strategic overview group, the goal group, into the matter.
Victoria Atkins.
Officer, in your statement that you provided to us, you refer to the fact that Jane was interviewed by a suitably trained and specialised officer.
That's correct.
Could you give us a bit of help with this? What do you mean by that?
We have officers that are specifically trained. It's called SOIT, Sexual Offences Investigative Techniques, and they're officers that are particularly trained. It's a very, very intensive course to deal with victims of sexual abuse, to understand their specific needs rather than routine plot turning up.
Because obviously we're dealing potentially with very vulnerable people.
Absolutely.
Who have, they complain of experiencing terrible crimes committed
Absolutely.
against them. And that requires sensitivity, but it also requires you to do your job to make sure that you achieve best evidence.
Absolutely, and I am to a certain degree reliant upon my officers and their competency and their ability to do that. And my job is, once they've achieved that evidence, is then to review that evidence and make operational decisions based upon what they have obtained.
And what are the potential consequences if things go wrong at that stage with the complainant?
For the complainant, there could be many. Their confidence in the police, their confidence in the justice system would be rocked, if not shattered. It's in other cases they've taken action themselves because it's become too much for them. So it's one area where we really do go above and beyond in what we need to do to reassure that person and to achieve the best evidence, but most importantly, not at the victim's expense.
And looking forward, if a decision is made to charge and then it ends up in court, what potential consequences can any mishandling at an early stage in the investigation have on the success of a prosecution?
it can have absolutely massive consequences. Everything is disclosable within the law, and what we've done is held to account, and quite rightly so. So our conduct, our actions are all scrutinised, often with 20/20 hindsight many months later.
And summing up your role as a police officer, you've talked about you have a job to do, you have no agenda. A theme that police officers often follow is that we go where the evidence leads us.
It's a well-worn quote, but it's quite accurate.
And where did the evidence lead you in this case?
The evidence led me to the conclusion that on Jane's account alone, the actual points to prove for rape were not there. Therefore, despite the fact that Jane was insisting she'd been raped, in law she hadn't.
And we've heard mention of Mr. Watson's letter. It was a letter to the Director for Public Prosecutions, but it was later publicised on the 17th of May on a website called XRO. Is that correct?
That's correct, ma'am.
So that information was then in the public domain?
Yes.
Thank you. And again, this is in the background, this is in the context, as you've described, of Mr. Watson bringing many complaints to you as investigating officers, and also the media context.
Absolutely.
Campaigning.
And unfortunately, we say unfortunately we have a free press, but we have a free press, and Jane, sorry guys, Jane saw fit to speak to the media. The difficulty being when she spoke to the media, her account varied slightly.
And it was precisely because Mr. Watson had brought these cases to your attention that you met with him and explained this particular case. Out of all the other cases, you explained it to him.
I explained this and the other strands that were live at the time.
Thank you.
How long did you head this unit?
From November 2012, when we first started the investigation, until May 2013.
And how many allegations, as opposed to convictions? You talked about convictions. How many allegations did you look at?
We had in the region of 400 bits of information come allegations at the beginning.
400?
Yeah.
And how many people have been successfully convicted?
We've got 3 convictions to date. Please appreciate that an awful lot of the information came from the internet and from was nothing more than rumour and anecdote.
And did you have to look into all those allegations?
We had to look into all of them to establish whether there was any truth to them.
Thank you. James Berry.
Yes, Mr. Sandor, you described how you were keeping Mr. Watson abreast of a number of cases, in fact, a significant number of complainants, yes? Without getting into the details of any of these cases, were all of these people Mr. Watson's constituents?
I don't believe any of them were.
You don't believe any of them were? Were you keeping in touch with those individuals, members of Parliament?
The only other member of Parliament I had contact with, and please forgive me, the poor gentleman's died and I can't remember his name, it was their MP up in Manchester who made representations on behalf of one of his constituents.
Was it Jim Dobbin?
No, Paul.
Anyway, let's not speculate as to who it was.
But he was the only other member that I had contact with.
Are you aware of the convention in Parliament that we only act on behalf of our own constituents?
Absolutely not, I'm a policeman.
Right, okay. You'd expect the MP perhaps to tell you that?
Possibly, yeah.
Were you keeping any, you described Mr. Watson as a stakeholder, were you keeping any other stakeholders abreast of developments, charities, NSPCC, etc.?
We had, within the strategic overview meeting, the Gold Group, we had various other stakeholders there, such as the NSPCC, who've been of great assistance to us, and then other law enforcement agencies, such as SOCA as it was then, the National Crime Agency as it is now.
Okay, so you've explained how in the meeting you set out the situation. Mr. Watson didn't really raise much of an objection then. Did he allege at that meeting that you failed to follow the guidelines?
Absolutely not. No. It was a very, very convivial meeting.
And so you didn't raise this with your senior officers? You went straight to the DPP with that complaint?
Absolutely no reason whatsoever to raise it with any of my colleagues or any of my senior officers. It was a very, very convivial meeting.
And your position is that you did follow the guidance? And actually, whereas you say that it wasn't proportionate to interview Lord Brittan, I think that what your evidence actually is that it didn't even reach the evidential threshold to interview him under the section of case that Mr. Burrows mentioned.
Absolutely, it fell at the first hurdle. What we set out to do was to strengthen the case as much as we possibly could, and in making those inquiries, it actually undermined the case. So it fell as soon as the evidential test was applied. It fell at the first hurdle.
So we didn't actually even get onto the issue of proportionality. It's more the evidence on your assessment.
Yes, where I talk about proportionality, that's before I sent the advice up to the CPS, where I was saying I'm not taking any action now because I don't believe it's proportionate, because I'm going to speak to the CPS.
And finally, as I understand it, it's your view that in a case where a suspect hasn't been identified in public or hasn't been informed of an allegation against them, that when that information does come out into the public domain, by whatever means, the police ought to inform that individual that an allegation's been made against them.
I think once it's out there, we've got a duty to inform them exactly what's going on at the earliest opportunity.
Unless there are operational reasons not to. I struggle to find an operational reason not to. Very good, thank you.
Tim Lawton and finally Stuart MacDonald.
We've all agreed that MPs and others in public office have a role, indeed a duty, in handing on information where they think it's of use to the police and representing victims, particularly if they're their constituents. How many times did you meet Mr. Watson?
I would say 3 or 4.
And what sort of thing did you discuss with Mr. Watson?
Just basically, the first meeting I had with Mr. Watson, I put things into perspective, the first meeting I had with Mr. Watson was in the presence of a man who was making a series of allegations, and a journalist who was there who, the guy wouldn't speak to us unless the journalist was present because he wanted it recorded, what he was saying. So that first meeting that we met with him, he gave us a series of allegations. We then had a subsequent meeting immediately after with Mr. Watson, where he said, by the way, we've got all of these, and handed over a load more allegations that were given to us. As a result of that, I met with him periodically. He came over to the office and saw the work of the team and what our other jobs were within the paedophile unit. Came over to see us, and I updated him periodically on the progress of those allegations he was aware of.
And when you say update him periodically, was he open to privileged information effectively?
No, because these people had come through him. So if anything, he possessed the privileged information before we did.
But presumably your investigations on the initial information that he gave you might have yielded further information, which was operational matters about the way you were handling it, what further witnesses it might have taken it to you that he wouldn't have been in receipt of.
Yeah,
did you share that sort of information or not? So he didn't have any privileged information. Did he try to direct you as to how you might do your job differently?
No.
So you felt he wasn't being involved in operational matters?
I felt he was being very supportive, and we had a very strong relationship with him up until that letter arriving.
So on what grounds do you think he could have had for then sending a letter, and why if he had taken issue with you and then not come to you to complain that he disagreed with your decision, would you have expected him to have gone to perhaps your line manager or a senior officer?
Yeah, I just... nobody was more surprised than me when the letter arrived. So
it was disproportionate, perhaps, to take it to the DPP rather than to take it further within the police themselves and then allow that complaint to become part of the public domain. What qualifications do you think Mr. Watson has got to judge the way police carry out their investigations?
None that I'm aware of.
And do you think that the way this case has panned out, the adverse publicity that it's had for the activities of the police, the relationship with Mr. Watson and others, do you think, you said that it had undermined your investigation and that it had the capacity to undermine parallel investigations going on, do you think this has had a more deep-seated influence on the way the police will continue to look at similar allegations in the future?
Yes, I do.
In what respect?
We're stuck between a rock and a hard place. We're there to investigate things, and some of the people we're dealing with are very vulnerable and susceptible to exaggerating. We're there to sift through things, but we're also working within a climate where we have finite resources. And when those resources need to be directed towards something which is more life-threatening or immediate, unfortunately, I can see a position being taken where things aren't necessarily looked at because of this.
And do you think that the way various details have been put into the public domain, not by the police, is going to have a detrimental impact on the ability or willingness of victims to come forward with further historical allegations in
Absolutely,
the future?
because we're in a position where this has been played out in the media and where quite often victims' accounts have been played out in the media. If we're now not seen to follow through on what has become accepted as fact because it's been in the media, then we are all part of the problem and we're all part of the conspiracy. The difficulty being that if the evidence isn't there from a purely objective evidential point of view, then we struggle to proceed with it.
So finally, you would agree that the way this case has panned out, the way that certain individuals have put it in the public domain, could be deeply damaging to the pursuit of historic child sexual exploitation cases, both for the ability and capability and willingness of the police to pursue them, and more importantly, for the effectiveness of victims coming forward and having their allegations properly looked at and taken seriously and pursued?
I think it has an impact, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Lord. Mr. McDonald, we're due to have a vote shortly, just to let you know.
As quick as I can. Mr. Settle, you described the liaison you had with the CPS and you described the advice they gave you as helpful. Now, I don't think anyone here would challenge the fact that you came to a perfectly reasonable conclusion about how the case should stop. Having said that, the advice that you got from the CPS, it didn't actually say that you shouldn't arrest or you shouldn't interview Lord Brittan. It left that matter to you, is that correct?
The advice I was given said that the arrest or interview of Lord Brittan was an operational decision for the police.
Sure. And in your statement you've said that one of the reasons why you took advice from the CPS was because you are, quote, not an expert in sexual offences.
That's
correct. Okay. Also in your statement you described the offence as, quote, not clear-cut. Is that a fair description? Okay. So what I'm saying is, perfectly understand the conclusion that you came to, but in light of those comments, would you not say that another reasonable police officer might have taken a different approach and they might have decided to interview Lord Brittan?
I do not, if the full facts are looked at, because the pivotal issue becomes reasonable grounds to suspect an offence has been committed, and those reasonable grounds have ceased.
So you don't think any officer, if any officer came in and said to the committee that they, in the same circumstances, would have interviewed Lord Brittan, you would say that would have been unreasonable?
I would struggle to see how any officer that had read my 30-plus notes of decision log could rationally argue against the decision I made.
Okay. In a case which is not clear-cut, what harm, what are the dangers of interviewing the accused person?
The issue for me at that time was one of anonymity and one of Lord Brittan's name being put out into the press and the associated issues that would come with. And as I've said, there were parallel investigations running at the same time.
Okay, I'll stop you there, but to clarify then, the prospect of media coverage was a factor in the decision? First and foremost, the evidence was a factor in the decision. The prospect of adverse media coverage was a factor in not arresting him or interviewing him until we had clarified the position with the CPS. And finally, you spoke about your dismay at the review that took place regarding the decision you made, and you indicated that you thought the letter from Mr. Watson was related to that, but then you also said that your understanding was the review had been ordered 2 weeks before the letter. How does that?
I've heard that that's the case, but I wasn't at the meeting, so...
Okay. Who did you hear that from?
I couldn't honestly tell you.
Okay. So was it somebody within the...
Somebody within the organisation, absolutely.
But how could a letter that hadn't yet been written cause a review to take place?
Good point, well presented.
DCI Settle, thank you for coming here to give evidence to us today. I'm still puzzled how you managed to get the CPS to give you advice, whereas Mr. Rodhouse, with his several letters, and senior management were unable to get the CPS to give them any advice whatsoever. But we will explore that with them. You've talked about a baseless witch hunt and a betrayal and the undermining of your investigation. But I go back to what I said to you before. 2 years later, after this had started and you'd come to a conclusion, the same conclusion was that there should not have been any charges. So even though you take no joy at this, you were in fact vindicated in your original judgment.
Yeah, I take no joy from it whatsoever, but yes.
And the distress that has been caused to the family of Lord Brittan must be immense.
I can only apologise and ask that, if in retrospect, if there's anything that I could have done which could have prevented that, I would quite happily have done it, because it's completely uncalled for.
Why did you stand aside as the head of this unit?
I was told to have nothing more to do with the investigation.
Any investigation or this one?
The whole Operation Fairbank.
Do you think that's because you had taken a stand, and you must not feel fettered in any way in talking to this committee? No one is going to do anything to you as a result of what you say, otherwise it would be a contempt of the House. Do you think it's because you stood your ground and said you really didn't think this should have been taken further?
Yes, sir.
That's a very serious reflection on those who made this decision.
Well,
so what are you doing at the moment, DCI Settle?
Not a great deal.
I see. Well, we'll try and make sure you're put to good use, because I think that the Commissioner has made it very clear he needs as many officers as he can in the force. Thank you very much for giving us evidence today.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Order. We expect to vote shortly, but we will call the Assistant Commissioner Patricia Gallan and Deputy Assistant Commissioner Steve Rodhouse.